can you tell us more about participatory narrative inquiry?
Yeah.
How it's different from collecting oral histories, and like what are the key outcomes? Like what's the richness of this process that we can consider?
Oh, okay. So the whole thing. Well, the first thing is probably best to talk about how they're similar. So, human beings make sense of the world with stories. That's what we do. That's how we process complexity. It's how we maintain our histories and encode lessons that carry forward in the future. So, as human beings, we're really built to do that, and we've created storytelling and stories as a way of knowledge management, actually, as a way of communicating who and what we are. And there's a couple of different kinds of stories. So there's performance stories, or stories that we tell to communicate, right? So, if I were to ask you, tell me the story of Stonebrook, and you would have your little thing, and the Stonebrook was founded, and this is what we do, and this is how many students we have, and that's stories for information, and those are helpful. And then there's stories that we use to make sense of the world, right? And these are the kind of water cooler stories. These are the stories that we're actually soaking in. In fact, it's almost not fair to call them stories because they're very small fragments of anecdotal information. And as we hear them over time, we begin to make sense of our world. And those are the kinds of stories that actually help us to act. Those are the kinds of stories that are like the elements, the atoms of culture, right? Like you can often discern the culture of a place by hearing those little tiny stories and not reading the PowerPoint deck of the principal, right? So the principal of the school will be like, "We're a kind, loving place," and all the parents are going like, "Hell, yeah," and I'm like, right? And the kids are like, "Yep, I got kindly bullied last week," So like the actual culture of a place is revealed in the anecdotes that we tell about it and the information that we gather that way. And the essence of participatory narrative inquiry is really what would happen if we could stand around the water cooler and eavesdrop on the kinds of anecdotes that people tell about a place. And so in this work, we work with that kind of story. So it's that element of story. These are not big stories, they're tiny stories, little ones. And the more little ones we gather, the more patterns we can see. And the more patterns we see, the more curious we can get about things. A feature of gathering stories for participatory narrative inquiry, which is a bit different from other kinds of qualitative and narrative evaluation, is that we actually don't code those stories. We let the storytellers do that. So we try and collect stories from storytellers in their own context. Like tell me a story of something that happened this week at your school, right? And then they tell a little anecdote. Like, here's the thing. And we could ask a story, like we could ask for an anecdote with, like, tell me about a moment that happened to you last week that is so Stonebrook, like that is just so typical, good or bad, right? That is just so Stonebrook. I love that question for actually eliciting cultural anecdotes, because then people will tell you something about like, oh, the water fountain was broken, and so we all went down to the store and, got water for everybody, and like that's just so how our community is, something like that. Little fragment. So on their own, little tiny stories don't tell us a big picture. But when we start collecting like dozens and hundreds of stories, we start to see some patterns. And even a story like that, like the water fountain was broken, so we all marched down to the store and got water and delivered water to everybody in the classrooms because it was a hot day, whatever. Even a story like that, we don't actually know what it means. A lot of times researchers will take a story and go, oh, that's a cool story. Let's grade it as cool. We like that one. That might have been a horrible story for the people in the experience, right? So participatory narrative inquiry both elicits those anecdotes and then also allows the storyteller to make meaning of them. Was that a good or a bad story? Do you think that story is typical of what happens at Stonebrook, or is that something that's unusual? Who was involved in this story? Was it students, teachers, parents, shopkeepers, community members? Like you can start to ask questions about stories. And those questions can reveal really interesting patterns for us to get interested in. So we do that typically with a survey tool. I use different kinds of digital platforms to do that are very specialized for doing this work. One of the ones I use is called Narra Firma, which is an open source platform, very, very helpful, very handy to use. But basically what happens is that as we collect, say, 100 stories about a situation or a place, we suddenly start to see stories that are like positive stories that seem super common in our organization. And we can gather and look at those stories together, because this is another feature of the work, is we give those stories back to the community and go, what do you see in these guys? What does this tell you about things we should continue to support in our community. These are all positive stories that people think happen all the time. And if we can pull out of those, right, things that we could work on together. And we can also look at negative stories that happen all the time. That reveals interesting information as well. What should we do to address these things? So the essence of working in a culture, in an adaptive culture, by using anecdotes, is that you always gain, the outputs you get are, you gain information that allows you to make decisions to create more stories like this and fewer stories like that. I mean, it's actually that simple, right? It's really that simple. Because as we're building a culture, there's no end to the work, right? It's a bridge that keeps going over the curvature of the earth for all time. Cultures are not something we build a good one and then we just sit back and put our feet up. Right? We have to continue working on it, continue monitoring it, and anybody who leads an organization knows you learn way more by just going out for coffee with your employees than you do getting the surveys back, right? Because the kinds of conversations you get when you overhear things in the staff room, when you're talking to students, when a parent, runs into you at the supermarket, those kind of unguarded conversations, that's where the real truths lie, right? And then you send out a survey and you go, name the top 3 things you like about Stonebrook. And they're always like approval seeking, trying to game it. It's like, ooh, I really like the way my child, is streamed into like whatever, right? Like it's always just kind of self-interested. So in the participatory narrative inquiry piece, we create the conditions for people to tell interesting stories, to recall interesting moments. And then we work with them. And there's lots of things we can do with them. We can look at story packs and we can pull stuff out. But from a history perspective, we can also look at stories and we can put them on a timeline together. We can get a whole school gym full of people that are placing stories on a timeline that's like, this is like the history. These things happened in the past, or these things happened in the future. Or if you're a student going through the school, here's what you're going to experience all the way along, So you can work with these stories in all kinds of different ways to build community and make meaning. It's a very, very creative process, right? It's like putting clay in the hands of people who already know how to use it, right? Because as human beings, we already know how to work with story. It builds community. It gives us actionable insight. That's the key outcome we get from PNI projects is actionable insights. And it gives you material to be able to work with and to be able to experiment with as leaders. Doesn't give you answers, right? Doesn't give you evidence that things are working or not working. It gives you patterns that you can inquire into, lean into, practice into, and move forward with. That'd be my elevator speech if the building was 45 stories high. Here. But one of the things I think you're talking about is what do we do with the stories afterwards? And one of the things we can do is actually create the story of who we are based on looking at this stuff. This is all the work of participatory narrative inquiry gives us, a kind of situational awareness that lets us understand who we are. And we can do so much with the material. There's just so much creativity that can come.